from Queen Mary University of London. He will speak about Hans Blumenberg as a political philosopher. I can mention only one of the last publication of Professor Nicholls, his book about Bloomberg theory of myth that published recently at Routledge, series about theories of myths. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Nicholls. Please.
So thank you very much, Pini. Thank you for inviting me here. This is my first time in Israel, so I'm very excited to be here and to be able to talk about Hans Blumenberg here today. I'm going to try and keep this relatively short to about 20 minutes, so I hope I can get my main ideas across to you about what I want to say about Blumenberg in that time. I think it's fair to say that we don't normally think of Hans Blumenberg as a political philosopher. He's mostly known as an intellectual historian in the way that Gabi mentioned, as somebody who has worked on the theory of metaphor, on the idea of modernity, on secularization, and on myth. And this was certainly my understanding of Blumenberg when I went to Marbach a few years ago as a Humboldt Fellow to start to work on a book on Hans Blumenberg and the theory of myth. And when I was there, I began to realize actually that Blumenberg is a deeply political thinker. And although I'm not necessarily enamored of an approach to a thinker which is heavily biographical, I think in the case of Blumenberg, we cannot ignore certain facts about his life and about the institutional setting in which he found himself when he started a career in Germany in philosophy after 1945. Now, it's well known that Hans Blumenberg was, according to the National Socialist racial laws, a so-called half-Jew or Halbjude, and the terror and persecution that he suffered because of that is, I think, relatively well known. What is less well known, however, is that when Blumenberg began his career as a philosopher in Germany after 1945, there had not really been a thorough denazification process of German philosophy. Or, let me put it another way, there were many philosophers who had been party members or who had signed the loyalty oath to Hitler. And there's a list of these figures here. And Blumenberg had correspondence with these people. He worked together with these people. He encountered them in day-to-day academic life. Right? This is a biographical fact. Now, what do you do as a young philosopher in Germany when you are in this setting and when you are working with people who have been, to a greater or lesser extent, followers of the regime that persecuted you? Well, my answer to that question is, you write a hidden political philosophy, or you write a political philosophy which is not explicitly political, but implicitly or latently political. Why did Blumenberg do that? He did it because he had to get a job, right? So he was in a position where he had to establish himself as an academic in Germany, and this put him in a certain type of position where the political arguments which he wanted to make were made indirectly or unexplicitly. Now, it's here where we need to compare Blumenberg with people like Ernst Cassirer or with Horkheimer and Adorno. So Horkheimer and Adorno wrote Dialektik der Aufklärung, in which they essentially argued that European philosophy, a certain strain of it at least, led to the Holocaust. Similarly, Ernst Cassirer, writing in exile, wrote a book called The Myth of the State, in which he analyzed from a political point of view the type of thing that happened in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Now, what is the difference between these people and Blumenberg? The difference is these people wrote in exile, Blumenberg stayed in Germany, right? So Blumenberg had to find a way of saying the things that he wanted to say about National Socialism, about German politics, within the institutional setting of German philosophy. And that makes his take on this unique because he did it in an indirect way. So today I'm going to talk about some of the texts in which Blumenberg did this. And my view is that actually the core of Blumenberg's political theory is developed around 1968. In these two texts, Wirklichkeitsbegriff und Wirkungspotential des Mythos, and especially in a text which is not very well known, Wirklichkeitsbegriff und Staatstheorie. And I'll talk about those now. Finally, and I'm going to mention these towards the end of my paper, the more political aspects of Blumenberg's work have now come out also in texts from the Nutless. And there are two texts that I want to mention in that connection. The first is Präfiguration, which I found in Marbach and co-edited. And the second one is a text on Hannah Arendt, Moses der Ägypter, which was published this year in 2015, and I'll talk about those as well. Right, so what is the core of Blumenberg's political thought? In a way, everything in Blumenberg's political thought comes from a certain question, which was asked by Immanuel Kant, Was ist der Mensch? What is the human being? And Kant's answer to that question was that the human being is on the one hand driven by certain inclinations or natural tendencies, instincts on the one hand, and on the other hand, the human being also has reason. And Kant's idea was that reason should triumph over instinct. Now, 20th century German philosophy was not satisfied with Kant's answer to that question. And what came to be known as Philosophische Anthropologie or philosophical anthropology provided a different answer to that question, what is the human being, by trying to see this question from a more biological perspective. Now, these thinkers, Max Scheler, Helmut Plessner, and Arnold Gehlen, all answered this question by saying that essentially the human being is poorly adapted. The human being does not have strong instincts. The human being has to compensate for a lack of instincts by developing culture. And by culture is meant tools, weapons, housing, clothing, and especially language and myth and stories and narrative, right? These are very important for philosophical anthropology. Now, this is an old idea. It's an idea that we can already find in Plato's Protagoras. It's the idea of sophistic philosophy, of the sophists, which basically argue that the human being requires language and requires rhetoric in order to make their way through the world and in order to debate what has to be done within the world. And Blumenberg is essentially writing in that sophistic tradition. This is how I see him. I see him as somebody who is working on the idea of rhetoric. And he first elaborates these ideas in a text which I mentioned earlier, Wirklichkeitsbegriff und Wirkungspotential des Mythos, which was given at a conference by a research group called Poetik und Hermeneutik in 1968. And what did he say here? Well, basically he offered a theory of myth, which is very close to Vico's theory of myth in the New Science, which essentially says that when the thunders opened above the human being, when frightful natural phenomena occurred, the human being started to give names to these things and tell stories about them, right? And the idea was that if you can name something, if you can personify natural forces and give them names, then you can also make certain kinds of prayers to them. You can come to terms with the situation in which you find yourself. Now, what is important for Blumenberg at this conference is that he argues that myth is inherently polytheistic, right? The mythic worldview is one in which there are many gods and in which there is something which he calls Gewaltenteilung, a division of powers, right? Now, it's here where this political term comes in. Myth operates through the division of powers. There is never only one omnipotent God. Rather, there are many gods competing for the same power. And quote number 1 on your handout, Blumenberg argues that myth is in this sense liberal, right? Myth does not stand before any decisions. It demands no renunciations. The liberality of myth survived only in the exercises of rhetoric. So in being primarily oral and not written, And in allowing numerous variations upon the one story, myth is tolerant, right? And essentially, this is an old view as well. Quote number 2 on your handout, you can see from David Hume, in which he essentially says that the polytheistic system is more tolerant than the monotheistic one. Now, in the same year, Blumenberg published his most political essay of all, Wirklichkeitsbegriff und Staatstheorie. And in this essay, he takes up the theme that is raised in quote number 1, namely the survival of mythic structures in rhetoric. And in general, this essay displays what I regard as Blumenberg's preference for sophism over philosophy, essentially. The essay turns on the idea, you can see it in the title there, that a theory of the state is always dependent upon a certain epistemology or theory of reality. Now, in Plato's system, of course, as we know, the philosopher kings know the forms, and therefore it is the philosopher kings who are able to institute political policy because they have philosophical wisdom. And there's the idea in this system of Plato that the philosopher kings have access to absolute truth or objective truth. So, according to Blumenberg, in his critique of sophism, Plato basically offered a totalitarian or a kind of illiberal politics. So, first of all, we can say that Blumenberg's position is an anti-Platonic one. Now, the most extraordinary aspect of this essay is the fact that it is a polemic against Ernst Cassirer. And it's a polemic against Ernst Cassirer's book, The Myth of the State. In that book, written in exile and published in 1946, Cassirer essentially argued that the outbreak of mythic thinking in National Socialism was not a suspension of the Enlightenment, but rather the calculated use of myth by people who knew what they were doing, essentially. Right? So it was the technological or modern use of myth for political purposes. And according to Cassirer's narrative, the main precursor to this use of myth was Machiavelli. Right? If we look at quote number 3 on your handout, we can see that Cassirer is saying that from Machiavelli's age onwards, politics became about winning the game rather than about there being any essential ethical relationship between political action and political thought. Right? In other words, politics in Machiavelli became divorced from ethics. Now, what is Blumenberg's take on this? Writing 23 years after the end of the war, and explicitly against Cassirer, Blumenberg claims that it is precisely Machiavelli who introduces a modern conception of politics that could prove to be useful in the Cold War. Right? For Blumenberg, a politics which divorces itself from ethics, as strange as that may sound, and which sees its idea of rightness purely in a notion of artificial correctness rather than ontological correctness, if you like, is a politics of words rather than deeds, right? It's a politics of rhetoric rather than action. And in the nuclear age, and remember Blumenberg is writing around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis after that, words are definitely preferable to deeds, according to Blumenberg. You can see this in quote number 4, where he explicitly says, Machiavelli's separation of ethics and politics has come to be seen as dubious on account of the cynical maxims of his Mirror for Princes. But this model of political techniques is not only applicable to the praxis of poison and dagger, rather it also allows one to recognize the development of that kind of rationality which is satisfied with certain actions being refrained from, prevented, or simulated. In other words, the more you talk, the more you engage in dialogue, the less likely you are to actually press the button, essentially. So modern politics, in Blumenberg's eminently disenchanted view, right? This is a melancholy politics. Should be about the preference for words over deeds, for rhetoric instead of action. And here rhetoric means first and foremost civilized behavior and the willingness to negotiate. This position is later reiterated in 1971 by Blumenberg in his well-known essay on Anthropology and Rhetoric, in which he again opposes all forms of Platonism in favor of apolitical sophism, and he basically argues that because humans have no access to absolute truth, all they have is rhetoric, words, and negotiation. Now, how is this later translated into a theory of myth? How does this reappear in Arbeit am Mythos, or Work on Myth, the main work by Blumenberg? Well, Blumenberg points out that myth was originally oral, that it was performed by rhapsodes, and these oral narratives were told again and again, and essentially the audience would say which version of the story they found the most appealing or attractive or significant. So in that context, those stories or myths which survived were the ones which could captivate the audience the most. Of importance to Blumenberg, writing on myth in the wake of National Socialism, is the idea that any society must have a plurality of such myths. Myths must be polytheistic. Unlike Cassirer in the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, Blumenberg does not believe that myth is a phase in human development that can be overcome. It is much more a primordial mode of orientation that can always reassert itself. Myth, for Blumenberg, will always be part of politics, and the key to coping with myth is to ensure that at any given time, multiple myths should be in play. Looking at quote number 6, we can see this in Blumenberg's debate with Carl Schmitt on the correct interpretation of Goethe's saying in Dichtung und Wahrheit. And this is what I mean by latent politics. This is how overeducated Germans talk about politics with each other. They interpret Goethe, right? Nemo contra deum nisi deus ipse. No one can stand against a god unless he is a god himself. Now, Goethe developed this saying in relation to the idea of the daimonic or das Dämonische, these grand political individuals such as Napoleon, who seem to oppose the entire world by marching through history. Now, Schmitt interprets this saying in a monotheistic way. He basically says a god standing against a god means the division between father and son within the divine, so that this nemo contra deum can have a monotheistic interpretation, right? Which is in line with Schmitt's own orientation. Blumenberg, however, says that this saying can only be interpreted in a polytheistic way. Any would-be god, like Napoleon, or let's say Hitler, must be opposed by other gods. There must be Gewaltenteilung, or a division of powers. And in quote number 7 on your handout, you can see he says this very clearly to Schmitt in 1975. Goethe's apothegm seizes upon the generality of the meaning of polytheism as its separation of powers, right? Gewaltenteilung here is the key idea for Blumenberg. All right, so let me now summarize what I have established so far. Blumenberg is a thinker who believes that myth and rhetoric are fundamental means of orientation used by a species that has no access to absolute truth. And in this sense, Blumenberg does offer what his critics on the German left called a rehabilitation of myth. But here, Blumenberg's response was precisely to argue that recent German history had shown that even in the most technologically advanced society, myth could never be completely overcome. The best thing that we can do is to ensure that in any society, a plurality of such myths is guaranteed. And Blumenberg, I think, saw this in the German constitution after the Second World War, that this would be guaranteed. Now, what is interesting here is that this emphasis on the polytheism of myth, in opposition to Christian dogma, is definitely a polemic against Carl Schmitt. But in other respects, Blumenberg's later writings on myth also demonstrate what I regard as a surprising affinity with those of Schmitt, and I'll talk about that in the last part of my paper. How are we going for time, Pini? How long have I got?
You have another 10 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, good. So Carl Schmitt had long recognized the importance of myth within politics. Schmitt had been an avid reader and acolyte of the French private scholar Georges Sorel, whose reflections on violence of 1908 had offered a theory of political myth that he applied to the French left. Schmitt adopted Sorel's general insight, namely that political action is best motivated not by rational ideas, but by emotionally captivating myths. This is quote number 8 on your handout. The criterion as to whether a people or another social group has a historical mission and whether its historical moment has come lies only in myth. Out of the depths of authentic life instincts, not out of reasoning or a consideration of purposes, there emerges the great enthusiasm, the great moral decision, and the great myth. In unmediated intuition, an inspired mass creates the mythical image that drives its energy forward. Now, what does Blumenberg do with this, or how does Blumenberg relate to this idea? The point that Blumenberg makes, and here I'm going to talk mainly about this second essay that I mentioned, Moses der Ägypter. The point made by Blumenberg is that often political decisions and the political rhetoric used to inform them or defend them are made on a non-rational, that is, a mythical basis. And it is with this idea in mind that Blumenberg turns in the essay Moses der Ägypter to a critique of Hannah Arendt's book Eichmann in Jerusalem, about which we will hear more today. Now, to briefly outline here what I take to be Blumenberg's argument in this essay. Blumenberg criticizes Arendt for having failed to appreciate the mythical dimensions and the rhetorical aspects of the Eichmann trial. As a moralist, Arendt's interest was in determining in what sense Eichmann was guilty and what that meant in broader terms about German society under National Socialism. And the phrase, the banality of evil, was intended to show that there was nothing extraordinary or demonic about Eichmann. Rather, according to Arendt, Eichmann was simply an everyman who failed to think through the moral consequences of what he was doing. Now, I'm aware that this view of Eichmann is a contested one, but I just present Arendt's view here. Now, of interest here is that Blumenberg's claim that Arendt failed to realize that Eichmann needed to be seen as evil and demonic, precisely because his demonization had to do with the defense of the idea of the State of Israel. This is quote number 10 on your handout. There are states that are founded through their enemies. Otherwise, no one would have managed to remedy the impossibility of their existence. They exist, although or because everything else that could have promoted their coming into being would have been too weak, too friendly, too ideal, and too literary in order for them to prevail against a world of resistances. That which the mythical act must concentrate into one figure, i.e. Eichmann, because otherwise it would not have been able to achieve the vividness that every foundation of legitimacy requires, appears to the political theorist, i.e. Hannah Arendt, to be too diffuse. So Blumenberg accuses Arendt of what he calls an Absolutismus der Wahrheit, an absolutism of truth. In seeking the unconditional truth about Eichmann, Arendt failed to see the bigger mythical picture. in some situations, implies Blumenberg, the use of political myth is the only means through which an apparently normative political outcome can be achieved. In this case, a rhetorical and a moral defense of the state of Israel. Now, this is an extraordinary text for a number of reasons. First of all, it shows that Blumenberg's ideas on political myth are in fact, and I didn't realize this when I wrote my myth book. This changes everything, this text, for me. It shows that Blumenberg's ideas on myth are very close to those of Georges Sorel, and perhaps also to Carl Schmitt. And the other thing that is interesting about this is that it shows, for the first time that I'm aware of, a Zionist Blumenberg, and that is something that we didn't know about before. This combination of Schmittian political theory and Zionism is an unusual one, perhaps even an uncomfortable one, perhaps. And maybe we can talk about that in our discussion today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Try to convince us that there is such a thing as a Hans Bloomberg political philosophy, but then I think the question is, what is relation to morality to begin with? So because you spoke about the distinction between moral and politics, but you have some kind of consequences if you speak about this kind of politics that are relevant to his ethics. So you want to say that he have ethics, or his ethics problematic and you go into the political side in order to avoid this problem, because his ethics is quite problematic.
This is the question about Blumenberg's politics, right? My personal opinion is that Blumenberg on political thinking is more a phenomenological description of political situations. So it's descriptive rather than prescriptive, right? So Blumenberg essentially says that whenever anybody wants to make an absolute moral claim, they are indulging in what he would call Platonism, or an attempt to develop some kind of absolute truth. And in the absence of absolute truth, the only moral thing that you can do is ensure that there will be a polytheism, right, of perspectives, which for Blumenberg in the post-war situation meant the Grundgesetz, the basic law of Germany, which, according to him, should ensure that there will never again be one God only. Rather, there will be many gods or many parties who will then fight it out on the stage of politics, and that the only ethical solution is that, essentially, to have a polytheism of views. Blumenberg, I think moral moments or normative moments in Blumenberg are very few and far between, right? He is more interested in describing a certain phenomenon or a certain situation rather than prescribing the way that people should behave in any particular situation. So thank you for that question, Pini, because that is the question, right? Can we use this as a political theory? These are not my personal opinions. I present here the opinions of Blumenberg.
I have some remarks, but I want to...
I have a problem with the timetable. You said in the first section, you say that his dealing with myth was a kind of a hidden approach which enabled him after 46. But the first text that you mentioned is from 68. Well, in 68 in Germany, the situation was altogether different. It was the Heute Brigade. I mean, it's different history. Mm-hmm. It's becoming much more perplexing when, in your last part of the lecture, first of all, it's Nachlass. He never published it. Mm-hmm. So you can't give a very high weight to. But the main problem is that his approach to Arendt is how much? 40 years after the book was published? And what is worst, it's deep, deep after the 67 war change in Israel. Mm-hmm. In the 80s, Israel, even among the most Zionist liberal trends, has a problem about finding a myth with origin. So, putting your thesis on this timetable, I think demands some corrections or some switches. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'm not going to offer corrections or switches, but I will offer an explanation. The first one is that, so Blumenberg gives this lecture Wirklichkeitsbegriff und Wirkungspotenzial des Mythos in 1968, which, as you know, was a very political year in Western Europe. And this explains why, from the point of view of the German left, Blumenberg was actually seen to be a conservative thinker, because they saw at this conference that Blumenberg was offering actually a rehabilitation of myth. And they had said at this conference that this runs the risk of being also a rehabilitation of the use of myth in National Socialism, right? Blumenberg then seeks to clarify this position in Work on Myth in 1979, in which this whole argument, which I've outlined here, polytheism, anti-Carl Schmitt, etc., is developed. So, yes, the situation in Germany in 1968 was a different one than after 45, but the issue was the same for Blumenberg in the sense that he was still working on a theory of myth, which could, on the one hand, have a political meaning, and on the other, would not be a lapse back into National Socialism. Now, before you respond, I'll answer your other question.
I'm not responding. I'm just making a remark that in '68, it's very understandable that Blumenberg has fears that this kind of thing may destroy the land.
Yeah.
So, but it's not, it can't be put as an approach to 39. That's the point. For him, that problem of myth and politics in '68, truly, I mean, justifiably, remind of some horrors, but those are not the same horrors that in '39.
You mean in light of Israeli political...
No.
Political situation?
No, 39 in the world politics. Anyway.
Right, okay. In answer to your second question about the Nutless, yes, one can always argue that the Nutless is the least important or the most important, right? Certain scholars, for example, Heidegger says of Nietzsche that the Nutless texts are the most important. In this case, I think we can lay some weight on these Nutless texts because of the biographical situation that I sketched at the start of my lecture. Blumenberg was in an institutional situation in which he was not able to say these things as openly and explicitly as he would have liked to do. And so he kept back many of these arguments, and now they emerge from the Nutless. So I think we need to see the Blumenberg Nutless partly in that light. That is to say, it's the Nutless of somebody who was obviously exercised by these political problems, but did not feel that he could express himself as openly as, say, Cassirer did, or Horkheimer and Adorno. That's the way I see it anyway. Thank you for your questions.
I will change the topic a little bit, and may I provoke you a little bit? Why do you?
Please do.
Why do we have always to come with Carl Schmitt when we discuss the relationship between myth and state, and that Carl Schmitt seems to be the main magnetism, the main figure in this configuration? Let me provoke you a little bit. I think you will find from Plato on in all serious philosophies, and Carl Schmitt was not serious, and he was not a philosopher. We can find, beginning with the Republic, the 10th book with the myth of I will speak about that a little bit later, the idea that we need something like a myth. We have different forms, different definitions of what a myth can be or should be. But why do you think it is so attractive in this very specific moment? I only want to hear more. That's the background of the question, Angus. Why do we need specifically this Carl Schmitt? And then you have also to outline, then if you want to put Carl Schmitt in this play, you have to take the 1938 Thomas Hobbes book about the Leviathan into the discussion, which is not really, I mean, a very nice book, to say the least. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's not my intention here to present in a normative way the ideas of Carl Schmitt. These are not my own opinions. But the reason why Carl Schmitt is important for Blumenberg is that Carl Schmitt is the main person with whom he is in dialogue about these questions in Work on Myth. In fact, Blumenberg even claims in the correspondence that Work on Myth emerged from a bet that he made with Gershom Scholem about the interpretation of Nemo contra Deum, nisi Deus ipse. And this is because Carl Schmitt had dealt with this in political theology too, right? So my answer to your question is no, we don't need to use Carl Schmitt for these debates at all. And that is not my own position. But if we want to think about Blumenberg as a political thinker, which is my subject today, then what we have to do is look at Blumenberg's relationship to Carl Schmitt. And I think if we look at the arguments that he makes in this text about Arendt, that he's very close to Carl Schmitt on political myth, and he's very close to Georges Sorel. And as you know, there was a direct line from Sorel to Schmitt. Blumenberg published reflections on violence by Sorel in the Theoriereihe of Suhrkamp, so he was aware of these arguments. So I think, no, there's absolutely no need to always bring Schmitt. That's not my intention. My intention is to enlighten people about Blumenberg as a political philosopher, and in order to do that, you can't get around Carl Schmitt. I'm sorry.
You don't have to be sorry.
Just a very short remark. I think that another perspective is missing in the way that we can dedicate the political philosophy. We didn't speak about Immanuel Kant in the overall picture of Hans Bloomberg philosophy, because I think that he played a very important role. Mm-hmm. And if we bring into the discussion the book on modernity, mm-hmm. or how many times in his writing he mentioned Kant. Mm-hmm. So instead of going to the direction of Schmitt or Gehlen theory of institution, if we say mm-hmm. over there is the political philosophy, mm-hmm. we can think that we can maybe through Kant build some more political philosophy. Because I think that this defense of modernity, this defense of idea of self, the outcome, can give us a different direction for this perspective of politics.
I think that's true, but that would be an attempt to rescue Blumenberg from Gehlen and Carl Schmitt, and that can't be done. Blumenberg is in this philosophical context. Kant is part of that picture, but Gehlen and Schmitt are also part of that picture, and there's no getting around that. As much as we don't like it, no, it's there.
But I think that here but I think that the idea is. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.